Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to c4. Knight g8 to f6. Knight f3 to g5. Pawn d7 to d5. Pawn e4 takes d5. Knight c6 to a5. Bishop c4 to b5, check. Pawn c7 to c6. Pawn d5 takes c6. Pawn b7 takes c6. Bishop b5 to e2. Pawn h7 to h6. Knight g5 to f3. Pawn e5 to e4. Knight f3 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Pawn d2 to d4. Knight d7 takes e5. Pawn d4 takes e5. Queen d8 takes d1, check. Bishop e2 takes d1. Knight a5 to c4. Knight b1 to d2. Bishop f8 to b4. Pawn a2 to a3. Bishop b4 takes d2, check. Bishop c1 takes d2. Rook a8 to b8. Bishop d2 to e3. Knight c4 takes e3. Pawn f2 takes e3. Rook b8 takes b2. Castle kingside. Rook b2 to b5. Bishop d1 to h5. Bishop c8 to e6. Rook f1 to f4. Rook b5 takes e5. Bishop h5 to e2. Rook e5 to c5. Rook a1 to f1. Rook c5 takes c2. Bishop e2 to d1. Rook c2 to a2. Bishop d1 to h5. Bishop e6 to c4. Rook f4 takes e4, check. Bishop c4 to e6. Rook e4 takes e6, check. King e8 to d8. Rook f1 to d1, check. Rook a2 to d2. Rook d1 takes d2, check. King d8 to c7. Rook e6 to e7, check. King c7 to b6. Rook e7 takes f7. Rook h8 to e8. Rook d2 to b2, check. King b6 to c5. Rook f7 to f5, check. Rook e8 to e5. Rook f5 takes e5, check. King c5 to d6. Rook e5 to a5. Pawn g7 to g6. Bishop h5 takes g6. Pawn c6 to c5. King g1 to f2. Pawn c5 to c4. Rook a5 to h5. Pawn c4 to c3. Rook b2 to c2. Pawn a7 to a5. Rook c2 takes c3. Pawn a5 to a4. Pawn g2 to g4. King d6 to e6. Rook c3 to c6, check. King e6 to d7. Bishop g6 to e4. King d7 to e7. Pawn h2 to h3. King e7 to d7. King f2 to f3. King d7 to e7. Bishop e4 to d3. King e7 to d7. Rook h5 takes h6. King d7 to e7. Rook c6 to c4. King e7 to d7. Pawn h3 to h4. King d7 to e7. Rook h6 to c6. King e7 to d7. Pawn g4 to g5. King d7 to e7. Pawn h4 to h5. King e7 to f7. Pawn h5 to h6. King f7 to f8. Pawn h6 to h7. King f8 to g7. Rook c4 takes a4. King g7 to f7. Rook a4 to f4, check. King f7 to g7. Pawn g5 to g6. King g7 to h8. Pawn a3 to a4. King h8 to g7. Rook c6 to c8. King g7 to h6. Pawn h7 to h8, promoting to queen, check. King h6 to g5. Rook f4 to g4, checkmate.